Tuesday morning, when they fired me, will haunt me forever. I'm still shaking just thinking about it. I walked into that conference room thinking maybe, finally, someone was going to recognize all the work I'd been doing behind the scenes. Instead, David looked me straight in the eye and told me they were restructuring for efficiency, and that my detail-oriented approach was no longer aligned with their vision. 3 years of staying late, fixing everyone else's mistakes, keeping that place from falling apart, and they made it sound like I was the problem. Like caring about quality was some kind of character flaw they needed to eliminate. But it wasn't just David who betrayed me. It was Olivia who spent months undermining me in meetings, making jokes about how I was too thorough, while she was submitting work that looked like a 5th grader's homework. And Madison, that fresh-faced college graduate who waltzed in and took credit for systems I'd built, processes I'd perfected, relationships I'd cultivated. She smiled and nodded and said all the right things while systematically replacing me in everyone's minds. The worst part wasn't even losing the job. It was realizing how alone I'd been all along. Sitting in that sterile conference room, signing papers that would erase 3 years of my life. I felt this crushing weight of betrayal that went so much deeper than just workplace politics. These people had let me believe I mattered, that my work had value, that loyalty and competence meant something. They'd let me invest my heart and soul in their success, while they were already planning to throw me away. But what happened next showed me who I really was underneath all that disappointment and hurt. And it taught me something about workplace betrayal that I wish someone had told me years ago. Sometimes, the best thing that can happen to you is discovering that the people you thought you needed never deserved you in the first place. I never wanted to be the person everyone came to when things went wrong, but somehow that's exactly what I became. It started innocently enough, back when I thought helping others was just what decent people did. I'd stay after hours at our little insurance office on Maple Street, fixing spreadsheets that looked like they'd been put together by someone wearing oven mitts. The fluorescent lights would flicker above my desk while I'd catch typos, realign columns, and make sure client names were spelled correctly. Nobody asked me to do it, and I never asked for credit. I just couldn't stomach the thought of sending out work that looked sloppy. You know? It felt like putting my name on something I'd be embarrassed to show my grandmother. But what I didn't realize back then was how much this quiet reliability would cost me. Every time I fixed someone else's mistake without making a big deal about it, I was teaching them that I was disposable. That my time, my attention to detail, my late nights didn't really matter, because I'd always be there to clean up the mess. I became like that old reliable car in the driveway that you never think about until it breaks down. People stopped checking their work because they knew I'd catch their errors. They'd submit half-finished reports knowing I'd polish them until they shone. And I let it happen because I thought being helpful meant being valuable. God, was I wrong about that? The breaking point should have come when I spent an entire weekend reformatting a presentation that Olivia had thrown together in about 20 minutes. She'd used 3 different fonts, the charts looked like abstract art, and half the data was wrong. I sat in my tiny apartment, surrounded by takeout containers and reference materials, making her work look professional. On Monday morning, she walked into the conference room like she owned the place and delivered my presentation to a room full of impressed executives. When they complimented her attention to detail, she just smiled and said thank you. That's when I should have spoken up. That's when I should have realized that loyalty without recognition is just exploitation with a prettier name. Instead, I kept quiet and kept working. I told myself that good work speaks for itself, that eventually people would notice who was really holding things together. But the truth is, when you're always working behind the scenes, people start to assume that's where you belong. They begin to see you as part of the infrastructure, like the copier or the coffee machine, something that's supposed to work without complaint or acknowledgement. My manager David would occasionally throw me a bone, telling me I was essential to operations, or the backbone of the team. But backbone is just another word for invisible, isn't it? You never think about your backbone until it gives out. The worst part wasn't even the lack of recognition. It was watching people who did half the work get twice the praise. There was this new guy, Carter, who'd been there maybe 3 months and was already being fast-tracked for promotion. His reports were fine, nothing special, but he had this way of presenting them that made people pay attention. He'd use buzzwords and speak with confidence about concepts he'd learned from YouTube videos the night before. Meanwhile, I was buried in the details, making sure our insurance claims were processed correctly. Our client communications were professional. Our compliance reports would pass audit. But nobody gets excited about compliance, do they? Nobody throws a party because the quarterly report has 0 typos. What really sealed my fate was when I started to believe their narrative about myself. When Olivia would make little comments about me being too focused on perfection, or when David would suggest I learn to let some things go, I began to question whether my standards were realistic. Maybe I was being too careful. Maybe good enough really was good enough. So I tried to ease up, to trust others to do quality work without my safety net. And you know what happened? Everything fell apart. Clients complained. Deadlines were missed. The regional manager had to step in and ask what was going wrong. But instead of recognizing that my attention to detail had been keeping things running smoothly, they blamed me for creating a culture of over-dependence on process. I wasn't just unappreciated anymore. I was the problem. That's when I realized I'd been playing a game where the rules kept changing, but only for me. While I was focused on doing excellent work, everyone else was focused on looking like they did excellent work. And in the end, perception beat reality every single time. But here's the thing that nobody tells you about being the reliable one. The one who catches all the mistakes. The one who stays late to make sure everything's perfect. You don't just become invisible to others. Eventually, you start to disappear from yourself too. You begin to wonder if maybe you really are just meant to be the person who fixes things quietly and gets no credit. Maybe that's all you're worth. But that was just the beginning of understanding how deep this betrayal would go, and how much worse things would get when they decided they didn't need their safety net anymore. The moment everything shifted happened on a Tuesday afternoon in David's cramped office that smelled like burnt coffee and desperation. I thought I was walking into a routine check-in, maybe even some overdue recognition for the overtime I'd been putting in. Instead, I got my first taste of what it feels like when your greatest strength gets repackaged as your biggest weakness. David was shuffling papers on his desk, not making eye contact when he dropped the bomb that would change everything. "You know, Emily," he said, still looking down at some meaningless document, "we've been getting some feedback about your work style." The word feedback hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire, and I knew whatever came next wasn't going to be good. "You're incredibly thorough," he continued, and for a split second I felt relief wash over me. But then came the killer phrase that would haunt me for months. "Maybe too thorough." Some people feel like you're slowing down the process with all your revisions and double-checking. I sat there in that uncomfortable plastic chair, the kind they probably bought in bulk from some office supply clearance sale, trying to process what I was hearing. Since when was being careful a bad thing? Since when was making sure our work was accurate considered problematic? But David kept going, explaining how the younger employees were feeling micromanaged by my attention to detail, how my standards were creating unnecessary pressure in the workplace. What really stung was the way he framed it, like he was doing me a favor by pointing out this character flaw I didn't know I had. "We need you to be more collaborative," he said, which I later learned was corporate speak for shut up and let other people's mistakes slide. He suggested I try to trust the process more, to let people learn from their own errors instead of catching them before they became problems. It was like being told that wearing a seatbelt was preventing other people from learning how to drive safely. The logic was so backwards it made my head spin. But I nodded along because that's what good employees do, right? They take feedback gracefully, even when that feedback makes no damn sense. The real kicker came when Olivia started using David's new narrative to undermine me in meetings. She'd make little comments about how some people get too caught up in the details, or how we needed to trust each other more instead of constantly checking everyone's work. She'd say it with this sweet smile, never mentioning me by name, but everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. It was like being slowly poisoned by someone offering you medicine. Each comment chipped away at my confidence, made me second-guess every correction I wanted to make, every improvement I wanted to suggest. I started keeping my mouth shut when I spotted errors, telling myself I was being more collaborative when really I was just being silenced. The frustration of watching preventable mistakes happen right in front of me was eating me alive. There's this special kind of torture in knowing exactly how to fix something, but being told that fixing it makes you the problem. I'd sit at my desk, watching Carter submit reports with obvious calculation errors, watching Olivia send emails with client names spelled wrong, watching deadlines get missed because nobody was paying attention to the calendar. And when these mistakes inevitably caused problems, somehow it was never traced back to the decision to muzzle the one person who'd been preventing them. Instead, it was just one of those things, or a learning experience, or part of the natural workflow. The worst part was how I started to internalize their criticism. Late at night in my apartment, I'd replay conversations and wonder if maybe I really was too rigid, too focused on perfection. Maybe normal people didn't care if a report had formatting inconsistencies, or if a presentation had typos. Maybe I was the weird one for thinking these things mattered. I'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, questioning everything I thought I knew about quality work and professional standards. It's amazing how quickly you can be convinced that your strengths are actually weaknesses when everyone around you keeps saying so. The doubt crept in slowly, like water through a crack in the foundation, until I wasn't sure anymore if I was protecting the team's reputation or just being a control freak. But deep down, underneath all that manufactured self-doubt, something else was growing. A quiet anger at being gaslit into believing that caring about quality was somehow wrong. A resentment toward people who could sleep soundly knowing they'd sent out subpar work with their name on it. And a growing awareness that this wasn't about collaboration or trust, or any of the buzzwords they kept throwing around. This was about making me smaller so that other people's mediocrity could look bigger. They needed me to believe I was excessive because accepting my standards would mean acknowledging how low theirs really were. But I wasn't ready to connect those dots yet. First, I had to experience what happened when they decided to make their disapproval public, and how much deeper the knife could cut when wielded in front of an audience. The monthly team meeting that changed everything took place in our conference room, which was really just a glorified storage closet with a table shoved in the middle and motivational posters peeling off the walls. We were all crammed around that scratched-up table, nursing lukewarm coffee from the machine that made everything taste like cardboard, when Olivia decided to turn me into her personal punchline. She was presenting the quarterly client satisfaction report, clicking through slides with this confidence that I now recognize as the hallmark of people who've never actually worried about being wrong. And then she got to a slide that made my stomach drop. It was a bar chart, but the data was completely wrong. The formatting was a mess, and the colors made it look like a kindergarten art project. "Now I know this slide is going to give Emily a heart attack," she said with a laugh, gesturing toward the disaster on the screen. But sometimes good enough really is good enough. The room erupted in chuckles, and I felt every eye turn toward me like spotlights. My face burned hot with embarrassment and something else, something darker that I wasn't ready to name yet. David was grinning. Carter was shaking his head like I was some kind of adorable but problematic pet. And the newer employees looked confused but laughed anyway, because that's what you do when everyone else is laughing. I tried to force a smile, tried to play along with the joke, but my mouth felt like it was full of sand. What made it worse was how calculated it felt. This wasn't a spontaneous moment of humor. This was a deliberate choice to use me as comic relief. Olivia had looked at that terrible slide and thought, you know what would be funny? Making Emily the butt of a joke about standards. She'd weaponized my reputation for caring about quality and turned it into entertainment for the whole team. And the worst part was that everyone went along with it. Nobody looked uncomfortable. Nobody defended me. They just laughed and moved on like publicly humiliating a colleague was just another item on the meeting agenda. After the laughter died down, Olivia kept going with her presentation, but the damage was done. For the rest of the meeting, I felt like I was watching everything through a fog. People were talking about deadlines and client feedback and process improvements. But all I could think about was how easily they'd all laughed at my expense. How quickly they'd abandoned any pretense that my attention to detail was valuable. I kept replaying the moment, wondering if I should have said something, if I should have stood up for myself. But what was I supposed to do? Object to being called detail-oriented? Argue that the slide really was unprofessional? Either response would have just made me look like exactly the kind of person they were already portraying me as. The real betrayal wasn't just Olivia's public humiliation. It was David's complicity in it. As my manager, he should have shut that down immediately. He should have recognized that using an employee's professional standards as comedy material was inappropriate and damaging. Instead, he laughed along with everyone else, sending a clear message that not only was this behavior acceptable, it was encouraged. After the meeting, when I was gathering my things with shaking hands, he didn't even acknowledge what had happened. He just asked me to take a look at the presentation before it went to the regional office, as if nothing had changed, as if I hadn't just been publicly designated as the office joke. That afternoon, I locked myself in the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the harsh fluorescent lighting. I looked pale and tired, like someone who'd been slowly disappearing and was just now noticing. The woman looking back at me seemed smaller somehow, diminished in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. I realized that this was what systematic undermining looked like. It wasn't one dramatic confrontation, or a single devastating blow. It was a series of small cuts, each one seeming minor in isolation, but together they were bleeding me dry. The private criticism, the public mockery, the casual dismissal of my contributions, all of it was designed to make me question my own value. Walking back to my desk after that meeting felt like doing a perp walk. Everyone was going about their business, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were all secretly laughing at me, all thinking about how funny it was that detail-oriented Emily got so worked up about slides and spreadsheets. I sat down at my computer and tried to focus on work, but every email I wrote felt scrutinized. Every correction I wanted to make felt like proof of their point. They'd successfully planted a seed of self-consciousness that would grow into full-blown paranoia about my own professional instincts. But they weren't done with me yet. What came next would make that public humiliation look like gentle teasing, and it would involve someone who would take everything I'd built and claim it as their own while everyone cheered her on. Her name was Madison, and she walked into our office on a Monday morning like she owned the place. Fresh out of college with that kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly tested, wearing clothes that probably cost more than I made in a week, and carrying herself like the world was just waiting to hand her whatever she wanted. I watched from my desk as David gave her the grand tour, his voice animated in a way I hadn't heard in months when he talked to me. "This is where the magic happens," he said, gesturing around our cramped little office like he was showing off the executive floor of some Fortune 500 company. Madison smiled and nodded, asking all the right questions, making all the right impressions, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. What struck me immediately was how differently she was treated from day one. When I started working there 3 years earlier, I'd been given a stack of policy manuals and told to figure things out. Madison got a mentor, a detailed onboarding schedule, and what David called grace period to get up to speed. Within her first week, she was invited to client meetings that I'd never been included in, asked for her opinions on processes I'd been running for years, and given access to systems that had taken me months to earn. It was like watching someone get the VIP treatment at a restaurant while you're still waiting for a table, except the restaurant was my workplace, and the VIP was essentially my replacement. The most infuriating part was how her mistakes were received compared to mine. Madison's first presentation was a disaster by any objective standard. She'd mixed up client data, used outdated templates, and somehow managed to misspell our company name on the title slide. But when she presented it to the team, all anyone talked about was her fresh perspective and innovative approach. David actually said he appreciated how she wasn't bogged down by conventional thinking, which was apparently corporate speak for, doesn't know what she's doing, but we're going to pretend that's charming. Meanwhile, I'd been labeled as excessive for catching these exact same types of errors in other people's work. Watching Madison get praised for work that would have gotten me criticized was like living in some kind of alternate reality. She'd submit reports with basic formatting errors, and people would say she was focusing on the big picture. She'd miss deadlines, and it was because she was taking time to really think things through. She'd ask questions about processes that were clearly outlined in the employee handbook, and suddenly she was showing initiative by seeking clarification. Every excuse they made for her was a direct contradiction of the standards they'd held me to, and the hypocrisy was so blatant it made me dizzy. But what really sealed my fate was how quickly Madison learned to play the game that I'd never even realized was being played. She had this way of taking credit for collaborative work without technically lying about it. When we worked on the quarterly compliance report together, she'd say things like, "I really want to make sure we get this right," in front of David, then privately ask me to handle all the actual verification work. When the report was praised for its accuracy, she'd graciously accept the compliments while mentioning how important it was to build on the existing processes. She never explicitly claimed she'd done my work, but she positioned herself as the driving force behind any success. The breaking point came during the annual client appreciation event. Madison had been with us for exactly 2 months, but somehow she ended up being the one to present our department's achievements to the assembled clients and regional management. She stood there in a dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, confidently discussing improvements to our processes and client satisfaction rates that I had researched, implemented, and monitored. She talked about our streamlined approach to quality assurance and our innovative client communication strategies, like she'd invented them herself, and everyone ate it up. They loved her energy, her fresh ideas, her forward-thinking approach. One of the regional managers even commented afterward about how exciting it was to see young talent bringing new life to the department. Sitting in the back of that hotel conference room, watching Madison get applause for describing work that had kept me up nights for months, I finally understood what was happening. This wasn't about performance or qualifications or even likability. This was about narrative, and Madison fit the story they wanted to tell about their company better than I did. She was young, polished, and spoke their language of buzzwords and aspirational thinking. I was the reliable workhorse who made sure things actually functioned. But workhorses don't get featured in company newsletters or regional presentations. They get put out to pasture when something shinier comes along. And that's exactly what was about to happen to me, though I didn't know it yet. I thought being indispensable meant I couldn't be replaced. I was about to learn that being indispensable just means they'll work a little harder to convince themselves they never needed you in the first place. The day they let me go started like any other Tuesday. I'd grabbed my usual coffee from the diner down the street, the one where the waitress knows everyone's order and the pie case hasn't changed since 1987. I was actually feeling optimistic for the first time in months because I just finished updating our entire client database system, catching hundreds of discrepancies that could have caused serious compliance issues down the road. I thought maybe this would finally be the project that reminded everyone why attention to detail mattered, why having someone who cared about accuracy was actually valuable. I walked into the office with something that felt almost like hope, completely unaware that David had already made the decision to destroy what was left of my professional life. The meeting was scheduled for 10:30, and I noticed the conference room door was closed when I arrived. Through the frosted glass, I could see David sitting across from someone from HR, a woman I'd only seen during orientation and the annual sexual harassment training. My stomach immediately clenched with that sick feeling you get when you know something's wrong, but you're not sure what yet. David's assistant, Harper, wouldn't make eye contact when she told me they were ready for me. She'd always been friendly before, but that morning she acted like I was contagious with something terminal. Walking those 15 feet from my desk to the conference room felt like walking to my own execution. "Emily, please sit down," David said, and his tone was completely different from any conversation we'd ever had. Gone was the casual, slightly harried manager who'd asked me to fix things on short notice. This was corporate David, the one who'd clearly rehearsed this conversation and was determined to get through it without any messy emotions. The HR woman, whose name I never did catch, had a folder in front of her, and that sympathetic expression that people wear when they're about to ruin your day while pretending to feel bad about it. "We need to discuss some changes in the department structure," David continued, and I knew right then that my career at this company was over. What followed was the most surreal 15 minutes of my professional life. They used phrases like restructuring for efficiency and aligning resources with strategic priorities and evolving beyond traditional approaches to quality management. They never once said I was being fired. They never acknowledged that this was a termination. Instead, they painted it as some kind of natural business evolution that just happened to require my absence. David actually had the nerve to say that my contributions had been valuable during a certain phase of the company's development, like I was some kind of training wheels they'd finally outgrown. The HR woman nodded along, occasionally making notes in her folder, treating the destruction of my livelihood like a routine administrative task. The part that broke me wasn't the corporate doublespeak or even the sudden loss of income. It was the complete absence of any recognition for what I'd actually done there. 3 years of staying late, of catching other people's mistakes, of building systems that kept the place running smoothly, and it was all dismissed as part of an outdated approach to business. David mentioned that they were moving toward a more collaborative, trust-based environment, and that my detail-oriented approach, while appreciated, wasn't aligned with the team's current dynamic. In other words, they were firing me for being good at my job because my competence made other people uncomfortable. When I asked about the client database project I just completed, the one that had taken weeks of careful analysis and verification, David waved it off like it was nothing. "That's exactly the kind of thing we're talking about," he said. "Madison has some great ideas about streamlining those processes using automated tools." I sat there realizing that all my work was about to be handed over to someone who'd been there for 10 weeks and didn't know the difference between our two biggest client categories. But Madison would figure it out, David assured me, because she brought fresh energy to problem solving. Fresh energy. That was apparently worth more than institutional knowledge, established relationships, and proven competence. The final insult came when they handed me the separation agreement. Buried in the legal language was a clause about not disparaging the company or discussing the circumstances of my departure. They wanted to pay me a few weeks of severance in exchange for my silence about how they'd systematically undermined and then discarded me. As I signed those papers with hands that barely felt like my own, I realized this was how they'd probably done it before, and how they do it again. Create a narrative where the competent employee becomes the problem. Bring in someone more palatable to replace them. Then erase the whole ugly process with legal paperwork and corporate euphemisms. I walked out of that conference room, knowing I'd never see justice for what they'd done, but also knowing that I'd learned something valuable about how little loyalty means when it flows in only one direction. The first morning I didn't have to go to work was the strangest day of my adult life. I woke up at 6:15, same as always, and lay there in bed listening to my alarm clock tick, while my brain slowly remembered that I had nowhere to be. No reports to review, no emails to answer, no meetings to attend where I'd sit quietly while other people took credit for my work. Just silence and the sound of my upstairs neighbor's shower running, and the garbage truck making its rounds outside. I'd been getting up early for work for so many years that my body didn't know how to process this sudden freedom, if you could even call it freedom when it came wrapped in unemployment and humiliation. I made coffee out of habit and sat at my little kitchen table, staring out the window at the apartment complex parking lot where people were leaving for jobs they still had. There was something surreal about watching the world continue to function normally when mine had just imploded. The guy from 3B was scraping ice off his windshield, probably running late for some meeting where he'd complain about deadlines and office politics, completely unaware that he should be grateful just to have problems like that. I found myself envious of his rushed morning routine, his obvious stress about traffic and schedules. At least his day had purpose and direction. At least someone expected him to show up somewhere. The hardest part wasn't the uncertainty about money, or even the blow to my professional identity. It was the crushing weight of all that unexpected time, and the way it forced me to confront how much of myself I'd invested in a place that had thrown me away like a broken printer. I'd spent 3 years making that job my priority, staying late, thinking about work problems in the shower, checking emails on weekends. And now that it was gone, I realized how little else I had to fill the void. My social life had revolved around work colleagues who'd apparently never seen me as more than a useful resource. My sense of purpose had been tied to projects and processes that were probably already being dismantled by Madison's fresh energy. By noon, I'd reorganized my closet, deep cleaned my bathroom, and started 3 different TV shows that I couldn't focus on. The apartment felt too small and too quiet, like it was closing in on me with every hour that passed. I kept checking my phone for messages from former colleagues, some acknowledgement that I'd mattered to someone in that place, but the silence was deafening. Not even Harper, who I'd helped train when she first started, bothered to reach out. It was like I'd been erased not just from the company directory, but from the memories of everyone I'd worked with. The betrayal of being forgotten so quickly somehow hurt worse than the betrayal of being fired. The nights were the hardest because that's when the anger would surface, hot and bitter and useless. I'd lie awake replaying conversations, thinking of all the things I should have said when David was spouting his corporate bullshit about restructuring and evolution. I should have reminded him about the time I caught that accounting error that would have cost us our biggest client. I should have mentioned the compliance audit we'd passed with flying colors because of systems I built. I should have asked him to explain exactly how my detail-oriented approach had become a liability when it had been saving their asses for years. But righteous anger is a luxury you can only afford when you're not desperately trying to hang on to your job. And by the time I was free to feel it, it was too late to matter. What ate at me most was the growing realization that I'd been complicit in my own destruction. I'd let them reframe my strengths as weaknesses. I'd accepted their narrative that caring about quality was somehow problematic. I'd apologized for being thorough, for catching errors, for giving a damn about the work that bore my name. I'd allowed them to make me smaller and smaller, until there wasn't enough left of me to put up a fight. When they decided I was disposable, the professional version of myself that had walked into that conference room was already so diminished that the termination felt almost inevitable, just the final step in a process I'd somehow agreed to participate in. After a week of this isolation, I started to understand something that no career counselor or self-help book had ever prepared me for. Getting fired wasn't just about losing a job. It was about discovering how thoroughly your sense of self had become tangled up with other people's opinions of your worth. Without the daily validation of being needed, even in a toxic environment, I felt like I was disappearing. But somewhere in that terrifying emptiness, something else was starting to emerge. A clarity about what had really happened to me, and a quiet determination to make sure it never happened again. The silence after the storm wasn't just an ending. It was the space where I would finally learn to hear my own voice again, and where I'd start building something that no one could take away from me. 6 months later, sitting in a coffee shop that actually knows how to make decent espresso, I got the call that changed everything. It was Harper, my former colleague, and her voice was shaky in a way I'd never heard before. "Emily," she said, "I hope you don't mind me calling, but I didn't know who else to reach out to. Everything's falling apart here." Apparently, the client database I'd spent weeks perfecting had been streamlined by Madison into something that barely functioned. 3 major clients had received incorrect policy information, 2 compliance deadlines had been missed entirely, and the regional office was asking pointed questions about why their previously stellar department was suddenly making amateur mistakes. The house of cards I'd been holding up had finally collapsed, and they were all discovering what happened when you remove the foundation from a building. Harper told me that Madison had lasted exactly 4 months before being reassigned to a different department, which was corporate speak for demoted without the public embarrassment. Her innovative approach to automation had somehow managed to delete 2 years of client communication history. and her fresh perspective on quality control had resulted in reports so riddled with errors that one client had threatened to switch providers. "We keep finding things you used to handle," Harper said. "Stuff we didn't even know needed to be handled until it wasn't getting done anymore." David had apparently spent the last month trying to recreate systems I'd built, asking everyone if they remembered how Emily used to do this or that, as if my institutional knowledge was something he could just piece together from office gossip. The vindication felt good, but not in the way I'd expected. I'd fantasized about this moment during those long, unemployed weeks, imagined them crawling back to beg for my help, offering me my old job with better pay and more recognition. But hearing about their struggles just made me feel tired, like watching someone repeat a mistake you tried to warn them about. There was no satisfaction in their failure, because their failure proved that everything I'd been telling them was true. My attention to detail hadn't been excessive. It had been the only thing keeping that operation from self-destructing. My standards hadn't been unrealistic. They'd been the bare minimum required for professional competence. What struck me most about Harper's call was how she described the aftermath of my departure. "Everyone keeps saying how we need to find someone like Emily," she told me. "But nobody wants to admit that we had someone like Emily and we let her go." They'd created a myth about who I was and what I'd contributed that was completely divorced from how they'd actually treated me. Now that I was gone, I'd somehow become the gold standard they were desperately trying to recreate. But when I was there, I'd been the problematic perfectionist who needed to learn how to let things go. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, but it was also illuminating. It proved that their criticism of me had never been about my actual performance. It had been about making themselves feel better about their own mediocrity. Harper asked if I'd consider coming back, even as a consultant, to help them rebuild what they'd lost. The offer was tempting in some ways because it would have been the ultimate validation, the acknowledgement I'd craved for so long that my work had value. But I'd learned something important during those months of unemployment and self-reflection. I'd learned that needing other people's validation had made me vulnerable to their manipulation. I'd been so desperate to be seen as valuable that I'd allowed them to define my worth on their terms. And those terms kept changing whenever it was convenient for them. Coming back would just be stepping into the same trap with better pay. Instead, I told Harper about the consulting business I'd started, helping small companies set up compliance systems and quality control processes. Word had spread quickly about my work because, as it turned out, there were a lot of businesses out there that actually valued attention to detail and systematic thinking. My first client had been a family-owned medical supply company that was growing too fast to keep track of their inventory manually. They didn't see my thoroughness as excessive. They saw it as exactly what they needed to avoid costly mistakes. Within 3 months, I had more work than I could handle and was charging twice what my old company had been paying me. The difference was that my new clients hired me specifically because of the qualities that had made me a problem at my old job. The strangest part of this whole experience was realizing that I'd never actually been the problem, even when I'd started to believe I was. The problem was a workplace culture that prioritized appearance over substance, style over competence, and personality over performance. A culture where being liked mattered more than being right, where being easy to work with was more valuable than being good at the work itself. I'd been trying to succeed in a system that was fundamentally incompatible with who I was and what I had to offer. Getting fired hadn't been a failure on my part. It had been a liberation from a place that was never going to appreciate what I brought to the table. And now, working with clients who actually understood the value of doing things right the first time, I finally understood something that had taken me far too long to learn. The right people will see your standards as an asset, not a liability, and if they don't, they're not your people. What workplace betrayal have you experienced that made you question your own worth? Have you ever been made to feel excessive for caring about quality? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below, because sharing these experiences helps. All of us recognize the patterns and protect ourselves from being manipulated in the same ways. Remember to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss more stories about navigating workplace politics. recognizing toxic environments and building the confidence to demand the respect you deserve. Your standards aren't the problem. The people who can't meet them are.